Hello, my name's Graham Priest, and I'm a philosopher, logician. Currently, I work at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, but by the time you're watching this, I'll probably be working at Tohoku University in Japan. Today, I want to talk a little about something to do with logic. Now, logic, the word logic has many meanings, and whatever you mean by it, I think it's fairly incontestable that one of the central notions of logic is validity. So we give arguments, they have premises and conclusions, and an argument where the conclusion really does follow from the premises is called a valid inference. And which inferences are valid and why is a central issue in logic. Now, when logicians discuss this question, they invariably will discuss some logical words, sometimes logical constants, so they're called, such as quantifiers, conditionals, modal operators, and negation. And how they all behave is historically contentious. We're not going to talk about all that today. I just want to talk a little bit about one of these, which is negation. So in what follows, we're going to talk about negation. I'm going to tell you a very standard view of negation and then why you might find it problematic. So here's where we're going. First of all, I'm going to talk about a little bit of grammar. So the word not, let's just get some facts straight about that. Then I'll turn to the subject of negation and give you a very standard account. According to this, negation is a contradictory forming operator. And we'll have a look at what that means. To do that, we'll have to discuss contradictions, contradictories, and subcontraries. When we've done that, I will then look at some well-known objections to the view that negation is a contradictory forming operator in this sense. And I'll give you some examples of reasons why you might doubt this. I will end with a short discussion of whether or not the two logical principles we meet, excluding middle and non-contradiction, are symmetric. So that's where we're going to end. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of grammar, and I'm going to talk about English grammar. Whether it applies to other languages, I'm going to leave to you to figure out. So you can think for yourself about whether what I say applies to other languages you may be familiar with. But I'm going to talk about English. So this word not in English. Now, the word not can undoubtedly express negation. So if you say she's happy and I say she's not, then I've just negated what you said. So the word not in that case expresses negation. But the word not need not express negation. So for example, suppose I say all humans are mortal and you say all humans are not mortal, then you have not negated what I just said. The negation of all humans are mortal is some humans are not mortal. So sticking a not into the sentence does not always negate it. All right, that's one reason why the word not might not express negation. Here's another. There's a notion of a use of not, which linguists call slightly oddly, from a logician's perspective, metalinguistic negation. And in metalinguistic negation, the word not is used not to negate, but to cancel what you might call a conversational implicature. So Great Britain has 4 countries: England, Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And England has been the dominant country historically in that foursome. But that means that the other countries have sometimes been sort of in the shadows. So sometimes when I talk to a Scottish friend, they'll say, I'm not British, I'm Scottish. Of course, if they're Scottish, they are British. But what they really mean is simply calling me British is ignoring my specificity as Scottish. Scotland has a very distinctive character of its own. And it shouldn't be sort of lost in just being called British. That's metalinguistic negation. All right, so what we've just seen is that the word not in English can express negation, but it can express other things too. All right, so if you want to negate something in English, a very sort of standard way of doing it is to prefix what you want to negate with the phrase, it's not the case that. So to negate A, you say it's not the case that A, and logicians will write the clause, it's not the case that, with this sign. And I will pronounce that as not A. All right. So those are a few words about grammar. So let's turn to a very standard account of what negation is. And this account goes back to this guy, who I'm sure you've heard of before. And according to him, negation is a contradictory forming operator. What did he mean by that? Well, let me explain. So first of all, let's talk about contraries and subcontraries. So A and B are subcontraries if at least one of A and B must be true. So suppose that n is a natural number, and consider the two sentences, n is over 10 and n is under 20. Well, one of those must be true. Of course, maybe for some n it's both true, but at least one of them must be true for any n. So those are subcontraries. Now, the dual of subcontraries are contraries. So A and B are contraries if both A and B cannot be true. So again, consider the sentences n is under 10 and n is over 20. They can't both be true. They might be both false, but they can't both be true. All right, so contradictories now, A and B are contradictories if they're both contraries and subcontraries. And there's usually an assumption that contradictories are unique up to logical equivalence, unlike subcontraries and contraries. So what we have here really endorses two very famous principles about negation. One is the principle of excluding middle, namely that at least one of A and not A must be true. And the other is the principle of non-contradiction, namely that both A and not A cannot be true. All right, so that's Aristotle's account, and it's been pretty standard in the history of Western logic. But it's certainly contentious, and what we're going to do now is look at some examples as to why you might doubt it. So let's deal with some possibly counterexamples to excluding middle first. Here's the first one. I'll give you three of each. All right, here's the first one concerning excluding middle. So we're in the Straits of Hormuz. The US boats are there. The Iranian boats are there. They've fought in the past. Maybe they're fighting today. Will they fight tomorrow? Well, the future is as yet undetermined. So one might think there are no facts about the future yet. At least maybe there are some facts. Maybe some things are determined. Maybe, for example, the sun will rise tomorrow. But we don't know, because it's not the case that the future about the sea battle is determined. So contingent statements about the future are neither true nor false, such as there will be a sea battle tomorrow. Who said that? Well, this guy, oddly enough, Aristotle again. So in the Metaphysics, he defended excluding middle and non-contradiction, but in another text, De Interpretatione, he gave the example of the sea battle and argued that it appears to be a counterexample to excluding middle. Now, how you settle the apparent tension between these two Aristotelian texts, scholars argue about. We're not going to go into that, but there's Aristotle trying to figure it out for himself. All right, so that's the first possible counterexample. Here's another, and this might look kind of familiar as well. The King of France is bald. As you probably know, currently France has no king. So the phrase the King of France doesn't refer to anything. All right. So some people have thought that if a sentence contains a non-denoting phrase, such as the King of France, then it is neither true nor false. So that's the second possible counterexample or kind of counterexample to excluded middle. Who said that? Well, the actual example I've given you, you probably recognize it comes from Bertrand Russell, and he didn't think that. So Russell argued that the King of France is bald is just simply false. So who said it's neither true nor false? Well, another very famous logician, this guy, a very young-looking Gottlob Frege. Okay, so that's two. Here's a third. This sentence is false. So this is one example of a very famous bunch of sentences which are self-referential and which are paradoxical. If you think about that sentence, if it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. So we have a paradox. Logicians have been debating what to say about this paradox for 2,500 years, and many suggestions have been made as to how you solve the paradox. One very standard solution is to suppose that the sentence is neither true nor false. If it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. But hey, it's neither. So many people have suggested this as a counterexample to excluded middle. Probably in the 20th century, the most famous person to have said this is this guy, Saul Kripke, who published a very influential paper on the matter in the 1970s. So there I've given you three possible examples or counterexamples to excluded middle. And let me stress that all those examples are contentious, as are all the examples that I will give concerning non-contradiction. So there's a lot more to be said about all these examples, but I'm not going to say it here. You can think about them for yourselves. So let us move on to possible counterexamples to non-contradiction. And again, I'm going to give you three. So here we go. Here's the first one. God, in the Arabic tradition and the Latin traditions, is sometimes thought to be a very strange object. And in the apophantic traditions, heavily influenced by Neoplatonism, some theologians have argued that God is a contradictory object. So one of them said this, and it's a reference to a text in the New Testament of the Latin or of the Christian Bible concerning Paul, at the time Saul, who had some kind of vision whilst traveling on, I guess, a donkey on the road to Damascus. So he fell from the donkey, and then the text says, Paul got up from the ground and with open eyes saw nothing. That's a quote from the Bible. Then this quotation continues, he saw nothing. That is God. God is nothing and God is something. So there is the person who gave you this quote arguing that God is a contradictory object. Who said that? Well, this guy, Meister Eckhart, probably the most famous apophantic philosopher of the 13th and 14th centuries. So that's one possible counterexample to excluded middle. Here's another one. And again, let me give you a quote from an historical philosopher. And it concerns motion. The quote says, something moves, not because it's here at one point of time and there at another, but because at one and the same point of time, it's both here and not here. And in that here, it both is and is not. So the thought is that if something is motion, it realizes a contradiction because it's both where it is and it's already gone a little bit further, so it's not there. So motion realizes contradictions. Now, who said that? Well, this guy, probably the most famous philosopher of the 18th and 19th centuries, George Hegel. So Hegel held that motion was contradictory. Okay, that's two examples. Here's a third. Oh, we've just seen this, haven't we? This sentence is false. We've got the liar sentence back again. And as we noted, a number of philosophers thought that this sentence was neither true nor false. But some philosophers have thought that it's both true and false. The argument which produces the contradictory conclusion is simply veridical. So here's another possible example to the principle of non-contradiction, namely paradox of self-reference. Who says that? Okay, well, I have to confess one of the people was yours truly. All right. Now, what we've just seen is three possible counterexamples to excluding middle and three to non-contradiction. And as I said, they're all contentious, but we're not going to go into the details now. But given what I've just said, you might think there's a kind of symmetry between excluding middle and non-contradiction because, hey, there are possible counterexamples in both cases. You might debate the counterexamples, they're contentious, but in that respect, they're symmetrical. The situations concerning excluding middle and non-contradiction are symmetrical. But that's not exactly true. Because once you move away from particular possible counterexamples and look at general arguments, the symmetry disappears. One of those principles appears to be more secure than the other, and it may not be the one you think it is. So let me explain. Let's set all the possible counterexamples aside. We're going to look at the general defensibility of those two principles. And let's start with excluding middle, although both of the general defenses I shall discuss depend on something which is often captured in a slogan called truth depends on being. And what that means is that truth does not float in midair. If something is true, there must be something which makes it true, something in reality, if you want to put it that way. So that's the principle that truth depends on being. If something is true, it must be made so by something in reality. So, for example, if I say Canberra is the federal capital of Australia, what makes that true? Well, it's made true by certain historical and geographical facts concerning a large island in the southern hemisphere of the Earth, literally our world. So that is an illustration which shows you that truth depends on being. Now, let's come back to excluding middle. But first of all, maybe I should give you a bit of terminology. If a sentence is true, I'm going to call whatever it is that makes it so a fact. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not presuming a correspondence theory of truth. I'm not supposing, a la Tractatus, that reality is made of things called facts. Fact is just a kind of word I shall use to refer to whatever it is about reality that makes something true. It could be a proof, it could be a verification, it could be whatever you think is the kind of thing that makes things true. I'm going to call that a fact, and I've put it with a capital F just to remind you that this is not a correspondence theory of truth. All right, so let's come back to excluding middle. Here's a general defense of it, and it goes as follows. Suppose that A is not true, then there is a fact that makes not A true. What is it? Namely, the fact that there's no fact that makes A true. So there's always a fact that makes either A or not A true. If there's no fact that makes A true, that very fact is sufficient to make not A true. Well, that argument is contentious, but at least it's a very plausible move that you might want to make in defense of excluded middle. All right, what about non-contradiction? Suppose you tried to give a corresponding defense of that. How would it go? Well, it would be something like this. If A is true, then there's no fact that makes not A true. That will be the kind of dual argument. That's not such a great argument. For a start, it's easy to suggest what facts that might make both A and not A true are. We've had some examples. So facts concerning God, bodies in motion, paradoxical arguments. True, they're contentious, but even if you dispute and get rid of those, that does not show that there are no other facts. Now, what we're meeting here is a very well-known asymmetry, which is that notoriously it's much easier to prove an existential generalization than a universal generalization. To prove an existential generalization, you just have to show the thing in question. To prove a universal generalization, you've got to prove all of an infinite number of possibilities, that there's no or every thing of a certain kind doesn't exist, or that there's no such thing of a certain kind. And that's much more demanding. So there's the asymmetry between those two defenses. Now, you might want to just sort of stamp your foot at this point and say, well, yeah, but there just can't be facts which make both A and not A true. But that, I'm afraid, simply begs the question. And indeed, it seems virtually impossible to mount an argument for the claim that there can't be such facts without begging the question. Now, that's itself a thought that depends much more, that requires much more consideration. And since I've more or less run out of time, I'm not going to go into that now. I shall leave that for your consideration. So let me just end with a few words. What we've been looking at is negation. We've seen that there is a very orthodox position about negation, which is that it's a contradictory forming operator, and that delivers the principles of excluded middle and non-contradiction. We've seen that there are possible counterexamples to both those things. So one shouldn't take those two principles for granted. And we've seen that there is a general asymmetry in those two principles, in that it's much easier to defend one in general than the other. So I've given you lots of things to think about. Let me end with a quote, well, a sort of quote. So you may recognize this. There's someone looking very puzzled, and he's not looking at the law of excluded middle or non-contradiction. He's looking at a skull, I guess. And he's pondering, to be and or not to be, well, that's the question. You probably know that this is a quote from Hamlet. So I shall leave you to ponder Hamlet's question for yourself. And if you want a few references to help your thinking, here's 3. The article on negation in the Stanford, a chapter of my own book, In Contradiction, and a chapter of another book of mine, Introduction to Non-Classical Logic. You'll find a number of the things that I discussed today taken up further in those. So that's it. Happy thinking.